Before it was a state, before anyone called it Maine, this land was wild. Not the kind of wild you see in paintings or postcards, but something older, deeper, and unbroken. The kind of wilderness that humbles you just by standing still in it. Imagine standing on a rocky shore in the early morning mist. Centuries ago, the Atlantic crashes endlessly against jagged cliffs, a rhythm older than time itself. The air is sharp and cold, even in June. Behind you, a forest stretches as far as the eye can see, so dense it swallows light. Pines, birch, and maple trees rise like walls. The ground is thick with moss, and somewhere in the distance, a loon cries over a silent lake. This is the land that would become Maine, raw, mysterious, and unforgiving. For thousands of years, it was home to the Wabanaki Confederacy, the people of the Dawnland. Long before Europeans arrived, they hunted, fished, and lived in rhythm with the seasons. They knew the power of this place. The cold wasn't an enemy, it was a teacher. The ocean wasn't a border, it was a lifeline. Every element of life here required respect and resilience. Winter stretched for months, snow burying villages until the world turned white and silent. Summers were short but abundant, rivers bursting with salmon, forests alive with deer, and coastlines filled with clams and shellfish. The Wabanaki learned to survive through balance, never taking more than the land could give. To them, this place wasn't wilderness, it was home. But to the outsiders who would soon arrive, it was something entirely different, a frontier at the edge of the known world. When the first Europeans appeared along the coast in the early 1600s, French explorers like Samuel de Champlain and English fishermen searching for new waters, they found a land that refused to be tamed. The storms of the North Atlantic battered their ships. The forests, though rich in timber, hid dangers they couldn't understand. Settlers froze in the brutal winters, and some never made it through their first year. Yet those who stayed began to form something remarkable, a culture of endurance. Every sunrise demanded work. Every nightfall carried uncertainty. But each generation that clung to this land grew tougher, quieter, and more self-reliant. They built towns where no roads led. They fought isolation with grit, not comfort. And slowly, Maine began to forge its character, not through victory or wealth, but through survival. If you were to meet one of these early settlers, calloused hands, weathered face, steady eyes, you'd sense something deeper than fatigue. You'd see a quiet pride, the kind that comes only from facing nature's worst and refusing to yield. These people weren't seeking fame or fortune. They were seeking a life, any life, that could be carved from the rock and forest around them. They endured because there was no other choice, and that endurance became something almost sacred. Generations later, that same spirit would still echo through Maine's identity. You can feel it in the way Mainers speak, plain, practical, and honest. You can see it in the weather-beaten houses that have stood for over a century. You can hear it in the sound of the waves and the wind through the pines, a reminder that nature is still the state's oldest resident. Maine wasn't built to be easy, it was built to be real, and that's exactly what makes it America's most rugged state. When the Europeans came, they didn't arrive with armies or fanfare. They came quietly, fishermen from England casting nets into the frigid waters, French trappers following the rivers inland, explorers sketching coastlines on damp parchment. They were drawn by what Maine seemed to offer: abundance, timber, fish, and the promise of untouched opportunity. But what they found instead was a test, a land that rewarded only those who could endure it. In 1604, Samuel de Champlain and his men landed on St. Croix Island, off the coast of what is now Maine. They built shelters, confident they could tame the wild, but the first winter hit with a vengeance. Ice locked their ships in place, food ran short, and scurvy swept through their camp. By spring, more than half were dead. Those who survived fled south, leaving behind graves and lessons. That pattern would repeat itself for decades. Settlements rose and fell like the tides. English fishermen established posts along the coast: Pemaquid, Monaghan, Kittery. But they too battled hunger, isolation, and the endless cold. Crops failed. Wild animals raided their stores. And every storm reminded them that the ocean was both their provider and their greatest threat. The settlers began to harden, physically and emotionally. Maine's environment didn't allow softness. Wood had to be chopped, nets mended, fires kept alive through nights that stretched 14 hours long. And when the howling wind tore roofs from cabins or drove ships against the rocks, people simply rebuilt, silently, stubbornly. Yet it wasn't only the weather that tested them. The French and English both claimed the territory, and their conflict spilled into the forests and rivers of Maine. The native Wabanaki tribes, long established here, were caught in the middle, allies one day, enemies the next, as foreign powers carved lines across their ancestral land. Raids burned villages to ash. Settlers vanished into the woods, never seen again. Entire towns were abandoned overnight. The region became known as a no man's land, too dangerous to settle, too valuable to ignore. But still, people came. Something about Maine's rawness called to a certain kind of person, the kind who didn't mind solitude, who saw challenge as opportunity. Fishermen, fur traders, woodsmen, they built rough cabins near frozen rivers, carved paths through endless forest, and learned to live by instinct more than rule. They weren't rich, they weren't famous, but they were free, and that freedom became addictive. Out here, no one told you how to live. You made your own tools, your own choices, your own fate. You learned that comfort was temporary, but courage could last a lifetime. Over time, the people of Maine developed a distinct identity, one born from hardship, independence, and respect for the land. Neighbors depended on each other, not on distant governments. A storm could destroy your boat, but a friend would lend a hand. The sea could take your harvest, but the forest would feed you. By the 1700s, the region had begun to grow, slowly, unevenly. Small towns formed along the coast: Portland, York, Castine. Each one had its own rhythm, its own struggles. The smell of pine and salt hung in the air, mixing with wood smoke from chimneys that burned through the endless winters. To outsiders, it seemed bleak. To those who lived there, it was life, real, raw, and honest. And while the rest of the colonies were beginning to dream of revolution and freedom, Maine had already been living it in its own way. Long before the Declaration of Independence, people here were already independent, not by law, but by necessity. They didn't need to be told they were rugged. They knew. Every scar, every frostbitten finger, every rebuilt home was proof. If you asked them what kept them there, why they stayed in a place where the winters could kill and the soil barely gave, they'd simply shrug and say, because it's home. That was the Maine spirit, before there even was a Maine. A spirit not born of comfort, but of confrontation with nature itself. And as the years passed, that same spirit would fuel something even greater, a growing desire not just to survive on their own land, but to govern it. Because soon, the question wouldn't be whether they could endure Maine. It would be whether Maine could finally stand on its own. By the mid 1700s, Maine was still a frontier, not quite a colony, not quite a state. It was an outpost of endurance perched on the edge of the known world. The rest of New England looked toward trade, politics, and prosperity. Maine looked toward survival. Its people were different now. Decades of isolation had shaped them into something rare, strong, skeptical, fiercely self-reliant. They weren't settlers anymore. They were Mainers, even if that word hadn't been written on a map yet. The winters never softened. The land never gave easily. But the people had learned to move with it, not against it. They built homes of timber they cut themselves, burned fires from the forests they cleared, and ate from seas they braved daily. The ocean, the forest, and the mountain had become more than scenery. They were characters in the story of their lives. And out of that struggle, something deeper began to take root, a sense of pride. You can almost imagine the scenes. Small cabins lit by oil lamps, the glow of firelight flickering against log walls as families told stories of storms survived, hunts returned from, ships rescued from the surf. Every tale was about endurance, and every child who heard them grew up believing that hardship wasn't a curse. It was the proof that you belonged here. That mindset, that quiet, stubborn dignity would become the heart of Maine's identity. But Maine was not a peaceful land. The wars of empire reached its forests and shores again and again. The French and Indian War turned its rivers into front lines. Forts were built, attacked, and rebuilt. Farmers left their fields to fight, only to return to burned homes. Entire towns disappeared, swallowed by conflict and time. Still, they came back. Always. The same land that punished them also called them back, as if endurance itself had become a kind of faith. And in a way, it had. By the time the American Revolution began, Maine was still technically under the control of Massachusetts, a distant government that collected taxes but offered little in return. To the people living through brutal winters and border wars, Boston might as well have been across an ocean. That distance, both physical and emotional, grew into resentment. Mainers had fought and died alongside the rest of the colonies, yet when peace came, they were still treated like the wilderness fringe. So they did what they had always done. They endured, and they waited, because endurance in Maine always came before change. The forests that once hid danger now held opportunity. Logging camps began to appear deep in the woods, where men worked long hours cutting pine and spruce for ships and cities far away. The rivers became highways for timber. The coastlines came alive with the scent of tar and sawdust. Maine was beginning to move, slowly but powerfully, toward its own destiny. The people who had once fought just to survive were now shaping an economy, a culture, a character that was uniquely theirs. And with each generation, the old question echoed louder. Why should a people this strong, this self sufficient, still be ruled from afar? The same spirit that had once faced the storms now began to question authority. The same stubbornness that had kept them alive through endless winters was now turning toward freedom. You can feel the tension building, like the moment before a storm, the wind rising, the forest whispering. Maine was ready to break away from being someone else's territory and claim its own name, its own voice. Because Maine was never meant to follow, it was meant to endure, and through that endurance, to stand alone. Out here, one might have said, you don't wait for someone to save you. You learn to survive, and then you learn to lead. And that's where the next chapter begins, when the wilderness forged not just survival, but independence. When the people of Maine decided that being forgotten by Massachusetts was no longer an insult, it was freedom waiting to be claimed. By the late 1700s, the people of Maine had learned every lesson the wilderness could teach them. They knew how to survive winters that froze rivers solid for months, how to rebuild after fire and storm, how to live with both humility and pride. But now, a new kind of trial began, one that wasn't shaped by snow or sea, but by politics. For nearly 2 centuries, Maine had been the forgotten half of Massachusetts, a distant, rugged region ruled from afar by people who didn't know its land, its people, or its struggles. Boston collected taxes, wrote laws, and sent governors. But when coastal towns were raided, when crops failed, or when the British Navy threatened the harbors, help never came. To the people of Maine, this wasn't just unfair. It was familiar. They had always been left to fend for themselves. Still, life went on. The forests gave work, the ocean gave food, the people gave each other strength. But slowly, something began to change. A quiet awareness that the same independence that kept them alive in the wilderness might also free them from those who ruled them. It started with whispers, in taverns, at docks, around campfires, after long days of cutting timber. Why should Boston decide how we live? Why should we pay for roads we'll never see? Why should men who've never seen our winters tell us what we can do? Those weren't just questions. They were sparks. When the American Revolution erupted in 1770, those sparks caught fire. Maine didn't hesitate. Its men joined the cause with a fury that came from generations of endurance. From Portland to Machias, volunteers and militiamen took up arms not just for independence from Britain, but for something more personal, recognition. One of the first naval battles of the Revolution happened right off Maine's coast, the Battle of Machias in June 1705. Local lumbermen, furious at British interference, seized a British ship, not with cannons or fleets, but with hatchets, muskets, and raw defiance. They didn't wait for orders from Massachusetts. They acted on their own. That moment captured something essential about Maine's spirit. No permission, no hesitation, just action. But war brought suffering too. The British retaliated with devastating force. In 1775, they burned the town of Falmouth, modern-day Portland, to ashes. Homes, churches, ships, everything gone in a single day. Families fled inland. The smoke hung over Casco Bay like a warning. Defiance had a cost, yet instead of breaking, the people hardened further. The same fire that destroyed their homes became the symbol of what they were willing to endure for freedom. When independence finally came for America, it did not come for Maine. The new nation celebrated liberty, but Maine was still tethered to Massachusetts, still ruled from a capital hundreds of miles away. And for the next few decades, that tension only grew. The loggers of the North, the fishermen of the coast, and the farmers inland all wanted the same thing: control over their own destiny. They had proven they could govern their lives. Now, they wanted to govern their land. But Massachusetts wasn't eager to let go. Maine was valuable, full of timber, coastline, and natural resources. To Boston's lawmakers, it wasn't an equal, it was an asset. So the struggle continued, quietly at first, then louder, year after year. Petitions were written, meetings were held, votes were cast and ignored, and every time Maine asked to be free, Massachusetts said no. That no became fuel. Because for a people forged by survival, denial was not defeat, it was motivation. They'd survived worse than politics. They'd survived centuries of isolation, of cold, of hunger. If Massachusetts wouldn't let them go, they'd keep pushing until the entire country had to listen. The Revolution had taught America about freedom, but Maine was about to teach America what stubborn freedom looked like. A freedom that didn't shout, it endured. A freedom that didn't wait for permission, it built itself. A freedom that grew not from comfort, but from struggle. And as the forests filled with the sound of axes and saws, as ships from Maine carried lumber across the Atlantic, as towns grew and families multiplied, one truth became impossible to ignore. Maine was no longer a wilderness ruled by others. It was a people, independent in everything but name. But that name was coming, because soon the push for statehood would reach as a boiling point, and once again, Maine's people would prove that the most rugged hearts don't just survive history, they make it. By the dawn of the 1800s, the forests of Maine were alive with sound. Axes rang through the cold morning air. Logs thundered down icy rivers. Ships creaked and groaned at their docks, sails snapping in the Atlantic wind. Life was hard, but thriving. From the coast to the inland woods, Maine was changing. Towns were growing, trade was booming, and the people were no longer scattered survivalists. They were builders, traders, craftsmen, and families. Yet even as the land prospered, an old shadow lingered. Massachusetts still held the reins. To the people of Boston, Maine was a distant province. Useful, yes, but secondary. They took the taxes, controlled the trade routes, and appointed governors who often never set foot north of Portland. For Maine's people, it felt like living in someone else's house, a tenant on your own land. The resentment deepened with every passing year. It wasn't just about money, it was about dignity. The men and women who had carved homes out of wilderness, who had fought wars, who had seen loved ones lost to storms and frost. They didn't want charity or recognition. They wanted respect, and soon they wanted something more: freedom. The call for independence began as murmurs, petitions written in candlelight, letters passed from town to town. But those murmurs grew into voices, and those voices grew into rallies. In 1785, 1792, 1807, attempts to separate from Massachusetts came again and again. Each time, the movement gathered more supporters, and each time it failed. Boston wasn't ready to let go. Maine wasn't ready to give up. That tug of war lasted decades, and with every defeat, the people grew more determined. They were tired of being the overlooked frontier, tired of sending their wealth south, tired of being treated as rough outsiders in their own nation. Then came the War of 1812, the final spark, when British ships appeared off Maine's coast, burning towns and blockading harbors. The people of Maine once again found themselves abandoned. Massachusetts refused to defend them, arguing it had no resources to spare. So Maine's people did what they had always done. They defended themselves. They built militias, fought invaders, rebuilt burned homes. And when the war ended, they looked south and saw nothing but neglect. That was the breaking point. If Massachusetts wouldn't stand with them in war, what right did it have to rule them in peace? The separation movement reignited with fury. Town meetings turned into rallies. Newspapers printed fiery essays demanding independence. Leaders like William King emerged. Men who could turn frustration into momentum. Men who spoke the language of Mainers, plain, strong, unyielding. We have long been subject to the will of another, King wrote. It is time we govern ourselves. By 1819, the push could no longer be ignored. The people voted, overwhelmingly, to separate. But even that wasn't simple. To join the Union, Maine needed Congress's approval. And in a divided America, every new state threatened to upset the fragile balance between free states and slave states. At that moment, another territory, Missouri, was seeking statehood as a slave state. Admitting Maine as a free state would preserve the balance. Denying it would risk chaos. And so, through political tension and moral fire, Maine's fate was tied to one of the most controversial deals in American history, the Missouri Compromise of 1820. It was a strange pairing, Maine's rugged independence entwined with Missouri's expansion of slavery. But it worked. On March 15th, 1820, the people of Maine finally stood on their own, no longer a province, no longer a forgotten frontier, a state, proud, independent, and free. When word spread across the rocky coastlines and timber towns, the celebrations were quiet but profound. Bells rang in Portland. Ships flew new flags. Families gathered around fires and told their children, "We're our own now." For the first time, Maine wasn't just a place. It was an identity, legal, political, and deeply personal. They had fought wars, endured famine, faced storms, and survived neglect. But through it all, they had never stopped believing in themselves. And when independence finally came, it didn't feel like rebellion. It felt like recognition. "We are who we always were," one man said. "Only now, the world knows it too." That moment, humble, unshaken, proud, marked more than statehood. It marked the birth of Maine's legend. Because while other states were born out of ambition or opportunity, Maine was born out of endurance. It was not claimed, it was earned, And as the new century began, the question was no longer whether Maine could stand alone. It was how far this rugged, independent land could go. When Maine finally became a state in 1820, the celebrations didn't echo like revolutions. There were no parades down grand avenues, no roaring cannons, no glittering declarations. Instead, there was something quieter, deeper, a kind of relief. For the first time, Mainers looked around and realized that everything they had built, the towns, the ports, the mills, the roads carved through pine and granite, belonged to them. This was their land, their government, their name. And with that realization came a wave of energy that swept through the new state like spring after a long winter. Maine's people had waited centuries for this moment, and now they set to work as if trying to make up for lost time. The forests became their lifeblood. The timber trade exploded, feeding shipyards from Bangor to Bath. Logs floated down the Penobscot and Kennebec rivers by the thousands, where men with ropes and iron-tipped poles danced across them like acrobats, guiding the massive rafts downstream. These were the lumbermen, the new heroes of Maine, tough, fearless, and endlessly resourceful. They worked in freezing conditions, sleeping in rough cabins, waking before dawn to the sound of axes biting into wood. They sang songs to keep rhythm, told stories by firelight, and faced the same ancient cold that had always tested Mainers. Only now, they faced it with purpose. Every cut of timber was a reminder Maine was building its future with its own hands. And just downriver, that timber was transformed into ships. Bath, once a quiet town, grew into the city of ships. Skilled craftsmen built majestic wooden vessels that would sail to every corner of the world. From Caribbean trade routes to the icy lanes of the North Atlantic, the name Bath built became a mark of pride and quality, a symbol of Maine's craftsmanship and integrity. While other states mined gold or farmed fertile plains, Maine traded in something more elemental: endurance. Its people turned struggle into art, weather into resilience, and isolation into independence. But even as prosperity grew, life was never easy. Winters were still brutal. Farms struggled on rocky soil. Families relied on the sea, the forest, and each other. When ships sank or mills burned, whole towns mourned together. That hardship created something you could feel just by meeting a Mainer: a quiet humility, a refusal to boast, and a deep respect for hard work. The rest of America began to notice. Travelers from Boston and New York wrote of the stern beauty of the land and its people. Writers like Henry David Thoreau ventured into Maine's wilderness in awe, describing it as raw and sacred, a piece of the world untouched by time. Through their words, Maine became more than a state. It became an idea, a symbol of rugged honesty, of nature unspoiled, of strength without arrogance. But for the people living it, that idea wasn't poetry, it was daily life. The same forests that built ships could swallow a man whole. The same sea that fed families could take fathers and sons. And yet, every spring, Mainers planted, built, sailed, and worked again. They didn't romanticize hardship. They respected it because they knew it was hardship that made them who they were. As decades passed, Maine's communities began to weave together like the fibers of a rope. Towns that had once been outposts became hubs. Churches rose beside mills. Schools taught the children of fishermen and loggers that this land, this hard and beautiful land, was something to cherish, not to escape. And always that quiet pride remained. The same pride that had guided them through storms, wars, neglect, now gave them something else, identity. By the mid 19th century, Maine had earned its reputation as America's rugged heart, a place where freedom wasn't loud, but lived, where people didn't just talk about independence, they practiced it every single day. You can see it in the stories of ship captains who crossed oceans, in the farmers who coaxed life from thin soil, in the fishermen who faced the Atlantic with nothing but a boat and belief. Every nail, every plank, every hit cast into the sea, they all told the same truth. Maine's freedom wasn't a gift, it was a discipline. And as the winds of change swept across America, as industry rose, as cities expanded, as the Civil War loomed, Maine stood steady, proud and quiet, with that same old resilience carved into its soul. Because when you've learned to survive the land itself, no storm, political or otherwise, can shake you. And that truth would carry Maine into its next great chapter, a chapter where it wouldn't just survive history, but shape it. There's a moment early in the morning when the mist still clings to the pines, when Maine feels unchanged. You can hear the ocean breathing against the rocks, smell the salt and cedar in the air, and if you close your eyes, you could almost believe you've stepped back in time. That's the thing about Maine. It never really let go of its past. It simply carried it forward. By the middle of the 19th century, the world around it was shifting. Steam replaced sails, cities grew taller, and America was charging into an age of iron, coal, and industry. But in Maine, progress had a different rhythm. Here, change wasn't loud. It was steady, like the tide. Shipyards in Bath began to evolve, building not just wooden vessels, but ironclad ones, symbols of a new industrial age. Logging camps pushed deeper into the interior, and paper mills began to rise along the rivers, their smokestacks piercing the morning fog. The same rivers that had carried pine to the sea were now powering turbines, lighting lamps, and driving machinery. Maine's forests became the backbone of American growth. Its timber built homes, ships, and factories across the nation. But through it all, Maine never lost its character. Even as the world modernized, its people kept the same values that had built it. Work hard, speak plain, keep your word, and respect the land. The Civil War would test those values in a new way. When the war began in Bonsiwan, Maine didn't hesitate. It sent more soldiers per capita than almost any other state in the Union. Among them was Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a former professor from Bowdoin College. He wasn't a soldier by trade, but he became one by conviction. At the Battle of Gettysburg, when the Union line was collapsing, on Little Round Top, Chamberlain and his Maine regiment held the hill against impossible odds. Low on ammunition, outnumbered, they fixed bayonets and charged. The move was desperate, and it worked. Historians would later call it one of the most heroic moments in American history, but to Chamberlain, it was simpler than that. He said, "In great deeds, something abides. That one act, brave, stubborn, and unyielding, wasn't just about war, it was Maine itself. The courage to hold the line, to endure when others would break. After the war, life returned to the forests and ports. Shipbuilding thrived again, and Bangor earned the nickname, the lumber capital of the world. But beneath the hum of saws and the clang of metal, there was something unspoken, a pride that Maine had not only endured, but contributed to the nation's soul. In those years, the state's image began to take shape in the American imagination. Writers, painters, and travelers came seeking authenticity, something they felt the rest of the country was losing to industry and noise. They found it in Maine. Henry David Thoreau, in his journeys through the Maine woods, wrote of the state as a place where man stands face to face with nature. He saw not desolation, but purity, a mirror of the strength within. That idea would stick. Maine became the embodiment of the American frontier spirit, not the Wild West of cowboys and gold rushes, but the quiet frontier, where toughness came from humility, not conquest. And while other states measured progress by population or wealth, Maine measured it by endurance, how well you could weather the storm, how faithfully you could hold to your values when the world changed around you. You could see it everything, from the fisherman casting lines before dawn, to the shipwright sanding the hull of a schooner, to the teacher lighting a stove before class on a February morning. They didn't see themselves as extraordinary, but history did, because the story of Maine wasn't written in victories or monuments. It was written in survival, in the thousand small acts of perseverance that defined an entire people. And that story didn't end with the Civil War. It only deepened as the modern world brought new challenges, new trials, and new battles for Maine to prove that resilience isn't just a legacy, it's a way of life. By the turn of the 20th century, Maine stood at a crossroads. The forests that once seemed endless were thinning. The age of sail was fading into memory. Mills still roared along the rivers, but smoke no longer meant progress. It meant exhaustion. Across the state, you could feel it. The world was shifting again. Electricity flickered into towns that had been lit by oil lamps for generations. Railroads cut through wilderness, once thought unreachable. Tourists from Boston and New York arrived by the trainload, drawn by whispers of Maine's untouched beauty. For the first time, the rest of America wasn't just taking Maine's lumber and ships, it was coming to see the land itself. They came for what Mainers already knew: the stillness of the pine forests, the purity of the lakes, the smell of salt carried on cold wind. In a world growing louder and faster, Maine became something rare, a refuge. But the people who lived here didn't see themselves as a tourist attraction. They were still working, still struggling, still surviving. Fishermen faced a declining catch. Farmers fought rocky soil. Mill workers battled long hours and low wages. And yet, through all of it, the same old spirit remained: quiet, honest, and unbreakable. The faces changed, but the rhythm didn't. Men went to sea before dawn. Women kept towns running. Families gathered at tables where the same stories were told: of ancestors who survived storms, of winters that tested them, of the simple pride in doing what needed to be done. Maine didn't grow rich, but it grew steady. While other states chased gold or glamour, Maine chased something rarer: balance. That balance was tested again in the Great Depression. Mills closed, ships sat idle, and work dried up. But communities pulled together the way they always had. Neighbors shared food. Churches became gathering places. Children learned early that strength wasn't about wealth. It was about endurance. Then came World War II, and once again, Maine answered the call. Its shipyards roared back to life, building destroyers and Liberty ships for the Navy. Towns like Bath, South Portland, and Portland became engines of hope. Men worked long hours in the yards, hammering steel in the bitter cold. Women stepped into roles they had never held before, welding and riveting beside them. Together, they built not just ships, but pride. And when peace finally returned, Maine carried something priceless out of that war, proof that its people could adapt to anything. The decades that followed brought new challenges. The lumber industry declined. Mills began to close. Young people moved south in search of jobs. For many towns, it felt like déjà vu, another kind of survival, this time against time itself. But Maine had always known how to live between eras, and it adapted again. Tourism grew into a lifeline. The same ruggedness that once seemed harsh now became beautiful. The coastlines, the cabins, the mountain trails, they were no longer obstacles, but treasures. Artists came, writers came, dreamers came, and they found in Maine something America had forgotten how to see: authenticity. The world might have been rushing forward, but Maine reminded people what still mattered: quiet mornings, honest work, and the humbling beauty of nature. Through the 1950s and 60s, Maine found a new identity built on the old one. It became the place where people went to reconnect with the land, with themselves, with something simpler and truer. But beneath that peace, the same toughness pulsed. The fishermen who fought Atlantic waves didn't do it for charm, they did it for survival. The loggers who hauled timber through frozen woods weren't relics, they were living testaments to an unbroken line of endurance. Even as industries faded, the character of Maine never did. You could still see it in every handshake, every weathered face, every porch light glowing against a snowstorm. This was not a land of ease, it was a land of honor, and that honor became its own kind of wealth. By the late 20th century, when the world seemed more connected but less grounded, Maine stood apart, a reminder that simplicity and strength can coexist. That beauty doesn't have to be tamed to be powerful. That people, like landscapes, can remain rugged and good. And that's how Maine found its second identity, not as America's forgotten frontier, but as America's soul of endurance. If you visit Maine today, you can still feel the old heartbeat beneath the modern world. It's there in the rhythm of the tides, the cry of gulls over the docks, the soft creak of wooden porches under fresh snow. Time moves slower here, not because it has to, but because the people have chosen it that way. In the 21st century, Maine stands as both a reminder and a refuge, a reminder of what America once was, and a refuge for those who still seek something real. The cities are modest, the towns close-knit, and the landscapes almost mythic in their beauty. But what truly defines Maine isn't its scenery, it's its spirit, that quiet defiance that's carried through every century. The industries that once ruled, logging, shipbuilding, papermaking, have changed, but they've never disappeared. Many mills have gone silent, yet some still hum. The lumber still moves. Fishermen still rise before dawn to cast traps into the icy Atlantic, their boat small against the endless gray of the sea. And though technology has reached even the farthest corners, life here still demands grit. Winters can stretch on endlessly. Roads ice over. Power lines fall. But Mainers do what they've always done. They help each other without waiting for permission or reward. It's not stubbornness, it's inheritance. In towns like Millinocket, Skowhegan, and Lubeck, people have learned to reinvent themselves. Old factories become art studios. Abandoned mills turn into community centers. Lobstermen diversify into tourism and aquaculture. The same creativity that once built ships now builds new ways of living. This evolution isn't glamorous, but it's real. Because Maine's story has never been about perfection. It's been about perseverance. And that's why, when you talk to people here, they don't describe themselves as tough. They just say, "We get by." That simple phrase holds centuries of meaning. It means surviving without complaint. It means working with what you have. It means seeing beauty in what others might call harsh. In a world that prizes speed, Maine prizes endurance. In a culture obsessed with comfort, Maine celebrates resilience. In a country chasing what's next, Maine honors what's lasting. That's why artists, writers, and wanderers keep returning, drawn by something they can't quite name. They come for peace, and they find humility. They come for beauty, and they find strength. They come for escape, and they end up rediscovering themselves. Because Maine doesn't dazzle you, it grounds you. You don't conquer this place. You learn to belong to it. And when you finally understand that, you start to see what rugged really means. It's not about muscle or might. It's about patience, grit, integrity. It's about waking up every day in a world that's never easy and doing the work anyway. That's what the Wabanaki knew when they called this the Dawnland. That's what the loggers and shipbuilders knew when they carved a life from forest and frost. That's what Joshua Chamberlain knew when he held the line at Gettysburg. And that's what every modern Mainer knows today, that real strength doesn't shout. It endures. When the wind howls through the pines and the sea hammers the cliffs, it's the same sound that's echoed for centuries, a hymn to survival, to resilience, to quiet pride. And maybe that's what makes Maine truly special. It never tried to be anything else. It didn't chase the spotlight or the easy road. It didn't bend to comfort or fashion. It stayed what it always was, raw, honest, and unbroken. And because of that, it became something larger than itself, a living symbol of America's original promise that strength and simplicity are not opposites, but allies. So when you stand on a Maine shore with the cold wind against your face and the sound of waves rolling beneath you, remember this: you're not just looking at a state. You're standing in the story of endurance, the story of people who refuse to yield, and in doing so, defined what rugged truly means. This is Maine, where the sea meets the stone, and the soul learns to stand firm.